So pretty, so tasteful, so elegant, so very Japanese. It's difficult to imagine someone not enjoying the subtle nuances of flavors and textures, the delicate seasonings and lively colors of sushi. But wait a moment. Is there more to know about Japan and the Japanese? Perhaps there is. Yes, I'm certain there is. If you are a sushi lover, or if you are enamored of Japanese culture, I hope you find this little message enlightening. During World War II, Japan held some 132,000 POWs from the United States, Britain, Canada, and elsewhere. Of those, nearly 36,000 died, more than 27%. Americans fared particularly badly. Of the 37,000 Americans held by Japan, almost 13,000 died. That's more than 35%. By contrast, American POWs held in Germany and Italy died at a rate of only 1%. And just how did these American POWs die at the hands of the Japanese? Some were bayoneted, some were beaten, some were burned alive, some were shot, and virtually all were starved. Starved. Of all the Japanese atrocities, one of the most shocking is something that has become known as the Bataan Death March. In April of 1942, of the 76,000 Americans and Filipinos who set out on this forced 80-mile march, 14,000 died or were massacred. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and on Nagasaki on August 9th, reprehensible though it may seem in the eyes of some misinformed and misguided people, was most certainly the best and most sensible option open to the United States at that time. Deplorable? Yes. Necessary? Yes. From the point of view of American POWs, the atomic bomb was a lifesaver. It is not widely known, but it is absolutely true, that the Japanese High Command, realizing that Japan could lose the war and that Allied forces might well recapture the POWs, had issued orders in May of 1944 to every POW branch camp commander to eliminate every single POW held in prison camps throughout Japan. Here are their exact words. If there is any fear that the POWs would be retaken due to the tide of battle turning against us, decisive measures must be taken without returning a single POW. And the order goes on, quote, at such time as the situation becomes urgent and it becomes extremely important, the POWs will be concentrated and confined in their present location. And under heavy guard, the preparation for the final disposition will be made. Whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates. In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate them all, and not to leave any traces. Unquote. If their POW experiences were horrendous, they were only a prelude to what would happen when these men came back home. Returning POWs suffered from a variety of symptoms, both physical and emotional, So serious were they that 8 years after the war's end, fully 1/3 of these men were found to be 50% to 100% disabled. The average POW lost 61 pounds during his captivity. In the first 2 post-war years, returning POWs died 4 times more often than other men their age. And POWs continued to die at unusually high rates for years afterward. Emotionally, the lives these men lived can only be described as wrecked. 42 years after the war ended, 80% were still considered emotionally impaired. These statistics, telling as they are, fail to convey the actual lives of these men. There was no peacetime for them. Some drank themselves to death. Others lived their lives as recluses, unable to interact with human beings. An Asian face could trigger uncontrolled rage. Some could not sleep with their arms covered for fear that they would need to awaken instantly and fight off a Japanese guard. Still others hoarded food out of fear that they would be starved again. All these men lived in the physical sense, but in passing their days on earth, were they really living, or were their emotional symptoms so crippling that they cannot be said to have lived at all? After the war, the utter horror of what POWs suffered at the hands of the Japanese became widely known, and justice was sought. There were war crimes trials. And yes, some of the Japanese who were found guilty of having enslaved, starved, disemboweled, tortured, and decapitated POWs were imprisoned. Some were executed. Among them, Hideki Tojo, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, and Masuharu Homa, the man behind the Bataan Death March. Others were sent to prison. But time passes. Passions subside. Men, the guilty and their victims, die. And then, of course, there's politics. There's always politics. The years following the end of World War II were the early years of the Cold War. The Soviet Union posed a real threat, and fear makes strange bedfellows. Communism was also making its way across the Far East. America's leaders believed that an alliance with Japan was crucial to national security. And so in December of 1948, presidential hopeful Douglas MacArthur declared a Christmas amnesty for 17 of the most egregious Japanese war criminals. 10 months later, the trials of others who had tortured and maimed POWs were ended. In time, many convicted war criminals had their prison sentences shortened. Others were made eligible for parole. In 1951, Japan and the United States signed the Treaty of Peace that ended the occupation of Japan. It waived the right of former POWs and their families to seek reparations from Japan and from Japanese companies that had profited by the slave labor of POWs. In March 1952, all efforts to apprehend Japanese war criminals were ended. Sushi. Enjoy your sushi, but do not forget. Do not forget.